Welcome to this edition of Africa 360, your current affairs show that unpacks Africa, where we go beyond the headlines to bring you simply what you won't see anywhere else. If it's about Africa, we always talk about it on the show. I'm Chris Maruleng, and this is Africa 360. In this edition, a promise made at the turn of the century and a way to measure global development progress. The deadline for the Millennium Development Goals is fast approaching, but much of Africa still lags behind. This week on Africa 360, we talk about the MDGs and what will happen in Africa beyond 2015. All this and more coming up on Africa 360. Well, more than a decade ago, world leaders gathered in New York and declared their support for the Millennium Development Goals. The deadline is now just over 2 years away. And the most important question now is what happens afterwards? Well, the Southern Africa Trust and the African Grant Makers Network recently met in Johannesburg, South Africa, to discuss exactly those issues. The dialogue brought together some of the continent's greatest minds, and Africa 360 was there as a media partner. And I facilitated a panel that was made up of Charles Sabugre Akiliera from the United Nations Millennium Campaign in Ghana and Zaki Ahmed from the Social Justice Coalition in South Africa. And we were joined by Dr. Hesfina Rukato, who is Deputy Chief of Staff at the African Union Commission. I kicked off the discussion by asking the panelists if the MDGs are key to driving the sort of desired human development we'd like to see on our continent.
The very reason why we went back to the MDGs, I mean, the MDGs are not the beginning of Africa's agenda for social development. The post-independent nationalist agenda was based on three things: dealing with hunger, dealing with ignorance, which is education, and dealing with disease. And that is the reason why, if you look at our data, our greatest rate of social progress and economic progress was the 1960s up till mid-1970s, when commodity prices collapsed in the world and we went into crisis. The point I'm saying is the MDGs retained to the basics of our post-independence agenda, but it's a limited agenda. It is not the agenda that takes us to the next step. But we cannot make the next step if we don't educate our children, keep them alive, and have a healthy workforce.
Thank you very much, Charles. Let's bring Hespina into the dialogue.
I think, Charles, I'm one of the impatient ones. When at least I say we are not making enough progress, it's not to say we are where we were 50 years ago, and I have no explanation to tell a child who's not going to school to say, you know what, today is just one you are not going to school. 10 years ago, there were 20 of you, so we are lucky, we are fine. That I find it unexplainable. So I think when we say we are not making enough progress, it's in the context of what is happening around us, in the context of the so-called liberation struggles. If we had been patient enough with the liberation struggle, we'll still be fighting in the bush right now. We were impatient, that's why we won. So why can't we be impatient with poverty?
Indeed. Zaki.
As Africans, we can think, but let's not forget, Makerere is not the university today that it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Ibadan, the same. And it is our duty to fix that. We were advised that only investment into primary education would strengthen our schools, will strengthen our societies. But what happened then is that our middle classes fled to the United States and elsewhere. And it's our duty now to look at how we're going to change this. And one of the ways I think we must change it is we must look at harmonizing a set of laws on the continent. One of the things that we have to have is the free movement of people. Because if we have the free movement of people, Angola requires a lot of assistance. The Congo requires a lot of assistance. South Africa has a very stupid belief that everyone wants to come here. Everyone does not want to come here. Everyone wants to build the continent. And if we ensure that the roads between here and Luanda are strong, the telecommunications between here and Luanda are strong, that our migrant workers can move and have decent living conditions, then it would be good. That is what donors have to look at organizations locally to make sure that they understand the economy, the global 21st century global economy that we're moving into.
Thanks, Zaki. One of the interesting things, and I want to open this up to all of you to get a response, is that the Millennium Development Goals talk about developing, and really the public sector would be the driver of that. You've been talking about enhancing intra-Africa trade. Currently, the African Development Bank indicates that intra-Africa trade falls at somewhere less than 14%. When you look at the averages in other continents, it's well over 40, sometimes 50%. The challenge here is that, don't you believe that there is now a need for the private sector to become actively involved in this?
Yes, if the private sector is there, I can say besides South Africa and a few other countries, which private sector can you talk about? And do we have enough of a conducive environment for the private sector to grow in countries where actually people are still not educated enough for them to go or to innovate and create the basis for private sector growth?
We have resources, well endowed with resources in Africa. Could this not be the driver of this growth that we're looking for?
It should be the driver. I think it's almost our insurance. If anything else happens, after all, we are, what do we say, we're the most endowed continent in the world, but it's always potentially. Because if our people were educated, if we created enough competition for scientists to innovate, to explore, to find the diamonds, to find the oil, and to find the gold, who finds the gold all the time in the African countries? It's not African entrepreneurs. Who finds the oil? It's not African entrepreneurs. Africans in those countries, they've actually now to apply for jobs to external companies that have discovered the oil. So it's almost a non-issue whether or not the private sector participates. We just don't have it enough.
Have we failed then as Africa to beneficiate these resources? And therefore, it would appear to me that unless we're beginning to see greater beneficiation of these resources and private sector participation, the talk of Millennium Development Goals being driven by a public sector and a few supporting NGOs is a pipe dream.
I would say we have failed, but like everybody's been saying, we stand at a point where we can make that history. We can change it. It's only us that can change it. Why don't we beneficiate the so-called resources?
Sean, come in.
The private sector cannot function without an effective public sector. The public sector has to function to provide us with the teachers, the agric extension workers, to support our agricultural sector. Now, when you talk about beneficiation, the issue of natural resources and the benefits of natural resources is more than beneficiation. The entire economy of the natural resource sector is not simply the upstream value addition. It is also the services and the smaller downstream businesses that we need to identify and put our people at the heart of it.
Even if you say you can go to school, if I don't have money to go to school, it doesn't make that you're giving me a choice. You can say you can drink as much water you want in a day. If I don't have access to that water, that's not democracy.
There seems to be this construction, particularly amongst, in this sector, of non-governmental organizations and people in the non-governance sector, which says or draws a conclusion that there's a correlation between high growth levels, good governance, and democratization. And we see this theme also being emphasized in the concept of Millennium Development Goals. I would challenge that and actually say that what we are seeing around the world, even in Africa, is sometimes the absence of good governance and democracy, and a shift maybe towards efficient governance, where it's about delivering services, having high economic growth and not necessarily having this Western liberal notion of democratization?
I don't know if you want us to go back to the definition of democracy. But for me, the whole issue of democracy is very much based on attaining certain basic services. Even if you say you can go to school, if I don't have money to go to school, it doesn't make that you're giving me a choice. You can say you can drink as much water you want in a day. If I don't have access to that water, that's not democracy. So for me, I don't want to say you're right, but I think we need to define things in the appropriate context. And obviously, service delivery for me is one of the first things that any government, democratic or not democratic, has to deliver on.
What is the next step? Can we have an African-driven agenda that pays cognizance to the things that we've mentioned? We've talked about democratization. We've talked about broadening private sector engagement in developing Africa. We've talked about ensuring that the education systems are improved. It sounds yet again like the Millennium Development Goals. I think we are not being courageous in our conversation here. And I think the courage will arise in actually identifying what the source of the cloud is that bears no rain. Let's go there first.
Leadership. Leadership is what the key, and I think I said earlier that our continent is ruled mainly by old men. And if you look at the average age of our continent, it's younger than everyone sitting on this panel, right? That's the average age. And the voices that we need to bring into this room are the young people at universities, the young people out of work, the young people in schools. And we need to get them into the conversation, because they are in the conversation. They're in the conversation on all their mobile phones. And leadership on our continent has to change. And that's why I say citizenship is the first thing that we need to look at. Citizenship and leadership.
Let's talk a little bit more about this leadership. Generally in Africa, when we talk about leaders, we tend to think about political leaders. Isn't this a distorted view? And is it not an abrogation of our responsibility also to develop other alternative forms of leadership? Hespina.
I think it's true to say that we've focused very much on brave politicians, people that can go and jump up and down in the street and therefore on that basis win an election. And sometimes they're not the best to run the countries or to be the CEOs of our countries. So I think we need to focus at what are the qualities of that leadership we're looking for. And for me, we can say women leadership, we can say we need more women, we can say we need more young people, we can also have young, foolish leaders, and we can also have old, clever, clever old leaders. So for me, the focus is, yes, age is important, and representation is important across age and across gender, but for me, it's what are the qualities of that leadership we're looking for.
So,
political leadership and the values that we're talking about arises from society. When there is an autocratic and repressive or corrupt leadership, it's only the people that can change them. When different forms of domination, this continent has fought to change leadership. So every society gets the leadership it deserves. But leadership is across the entire society. So politically, the culture of leadership that is demonstrated by the political class also reflects in the culture of leadership at the household. Repressive, patriarchal, reflects in also a substantially patriarchal and top-down household. It reflects in the workplace, top-down, patriarchal, and repressive. It reflects in our social spaces, including our funeral spaces. In a sense, the culture of leadership that we all wish to have, open, participatory, accountable, service-oriented, has to be cultivated throughout our society. That is why the issue of the society begets the leadership it deserves comes from. So it is not simply shaping the top, it is shaping the culture throughout institutions of society.
What we teach kids today is not relevant to where we want to go. So we won't be surprised, or we shouldn't be surprised if 20 years from now we can't use them or that education for anything that we'll be doing then.
I'd like you to indicate your interest in joining our conversation by lifting up your hands so that we can get a mic to you. Let's get them over there. Yep.
My name is Alexis Mabele. I'm from Southern Africa Trust. My question is very simple. Simple in the sense that by the observation, when we are talking about these development agendas, but what we see in reality, when we talk about the growth in Africa, what we see in reality, there is a big gap between those who are becoming rich and those who are becoming poor. And my question is, where is this growth that we're talking about is going?
Let me open it up. Charles, I'll start with you.
This issue of inclusive growth is at the inclusive growth is at the heart of the conversations about how do we go forward beyond the MDGs framework. And I think it will be a good thing to have that discussion broadened out as much as possible. But it is true that the structure of growth at the moment, because it is concentrated in a few areas, natural resources, real estate, the financial sector, that already means that the benefit of growth is narrowed. So if you look at some of the agendas for some of the African countries, they are saying we have to look at how to broaden this starting from agriculture and add value to agriculture. But if there is growing inequality, we can redistribute that income from taxation. So we have to make taxation work. The problem is we have a high level of tax avoidance, both from the large companies, tax avoidance, tax evasion, both from the large companies and wealthy individuals who also tend to be politically connected. Thirdly, the difficulty of reforming our tax system is also partly because those who should be reforming the tax system also have a direct personal stake in the tax system.